Hi, I'm Sam Gruber, and this is a bonus episode of my lectures on American Synagogue Art and Architecture for the Community Speakers Program of Orange County. My last lecture last week, I had to end before I'd covered all the material I'd hoped to get to. I was overambitious in putting together the PowerPoint, even with a rapid fire approach to looking at dozens of buildings. There really wasn't enough time to get to many more that deserve some attention. And some of the types of buildings and some of the historical episodes and the topics about religious and social organization, as well as architectural style, that I wanted to address deserve. So I'm going to give you a little bit more today. This is what I might have continued with if we'd had a little more time, or if I'd been a little faster in my delivery or less inclined to digress. So let me share a screen, and I'm going to pick up where we left off last time with the Moorish style. We had ended with looking at the great Orthodox synagogue of the Lower East Side, the Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York, that was built in the mid-1880s. And we had seen this as a development of the ostentatious, even exotic style that the American Jews had fully embraced after the initial ambivalence of their European cousins in the 1850s and 60s. But by the time the Moorish style had come to America and swept the country, particularly favored by the newly ascendant reform movement out of Cincinnati, by the time it had done that, it was fully embraced, not as an imposed exotic style, an Eastern or Oriental style that was non-Christian more than it was fully Jewish. By the time it came to America, American Jews were happy to claim it as their own. And by the time the German historian Heinrich Gratz wrote his History of the Jews in the latter part of the 19th century, which was translated into English and was widely popular, he told the story of the golden age of Jews in Spain, and this became the identifying historical rationale for the Jewish embrace of the horseshoe arch and the arabesques and other types of decorations associated with Moorish, North African, and Spanish, Muslim-influenced architecture as it became manifest in these new American creations. Initially, the Temple Emmanuel uptown at 42nd Street and the Central Synagogue at 54th and Lexington, these were Reform congregations of mostly German Jews or Jews of German origin or Central European origin. But in the 1880s, the Polish and other Eastern European Jews who had already established themselves in the Lower East Side, and they also reached out to many of their newly arriving landsmen, their fellow Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe. And in the 1880s, they built this very large, impressive building to rival those synagogues uptown. And they weren't at all embarrassed about using the Moorish style for this purpose. The building thrived for many, many decades, but fell into hard times in the 1960s. And only a small minyan would meet in the basement, where there was a bet midrash or a daily prayer room, study room, and the great sanctuary was walled up. This then was rediscovered by historic preservationists, and along with the birth of the historic preservation movement in America, which really kicked off after the destruction of Pennsylvania Station in the 1960s in New York. There was this move to protect and preserve buildings like Eldridge Street too, and a small number of people began a grassroots effort that really reverberated around the country and around the world and led to the full restoration of the building, though it took almost 25 years to complete. And this was reopened as a museum in 2009. I mentioned there's a new stained glass window above the arc. This is by the contemporary artist Kiki Smith. It's somewhat out of keeping with the entire, the perfection of the rest of the restoration. But for the people involved in the project, it serves as a bridge from the past into the future. And it was also a way to link what was once a synagogue to a contemporary cultural art scene in New York, with the hope that the synagogue would not only attract an audience of traditional Jews or Jews with nostalgia for the old days of immigration or curiosity, but it would also attract contemporary art lovers. And the project, the Eldridge Street Museum, has been largely successful in that and offers a very dynamic program, educational and cultural program around year-round, and is well worth the visit. The history of this is very, very rich, and I can't go into it now. You might notice the abundance of these so-called Moorish designs, most of which come out of 19th century pattern books like Owen Jones' Grammar of Ornament. The windows are non-representational, they're only patterned. The arc is made of a mix of historicist elements, but in a new arrangement, and very, very much like Victorian cabinet making of the time. But we find these horseshoe arches that is complete circles that are not quite finished. So they're implied, but they're not fully expressed. And this is a dominant theme throughout the style, as well as these fanciful patterns that are done with stenciling that suggests the decoration on in stucco and in paint of the medieval synagogues of Spain. We saw some of those remains in our first lecture when we looked at the Great Synagogue of Toledo, for instance, and there are a few other examples as well. This is repeated in the domes of the interior, in the stenciling of patterns and floral patterns and stars, and it creates a very, very exuberant, expressive experience. This style for the Orthodox did move uptown very quickly, and by the late 1890s, 1889, 1990, we find Zichron Ephraim Synagogue, known as the Park East Synagogue, being inaugurated as well. And this too has a very, very fanciful facade, asymmetrical, one tower, and you can see the horseshoe arches, and these incomplete circles, and the little gazebos with their multifaceted arches in the style of the Alhambra in Spain. This is the Moorish at its height, and inside the synagogue was equally exuberant in its architectural detailing. It had a little bit more painting to it than it does now, but you can still see the synagogue thrives as one of the leading Orthodox congregations in Manhattan until this day. This style swept the country, and it was fully accepted in towns and cities, from the north to the south, from the east to the west. And here are just a few examples from Chattanooga, from Kansas City, Atlanta, Newark, New Jersey, and from Helena, Montana. So you can see how widespread it was. Each one is a little bit different, and it allows variation, but we get the two towers with somewhat exotic cupolas, and we get the horseshoe arches. We get asymmetrical arrangements with some buildings. We get striped masonry in others. But none of these are like the churches and other public buildings being built across America at this time. So this becomes a distinctly Jewish style that anyone can recognize. The closest buildings to these are buildings for entertainment at amusement parks, and later on we'll have movie theaters with this type of style. But for this brief period in the late 19th century, Jews pretty much own the Moorish style, and it is fully synonymous with synagogue design. There are variations. This is Shari Tefillah from New York from the late 1860s by the Jewish architect Henry Fernbach, who had teamed with Eidlitz in Temple Emmanuel, and then had built Central Synagogue. You can see it's echoed in the 1890s with the first great synagogue by the really most successful American-born synagogue architect Arnold Brunner. This is built in 1891. He would go on to build many other important synagogues more in classical styles, and we'll talk about him when we talk about modernism. Even though his style is classicism, he was considered modern in his day at the beginning of the 20th century. But here in 91, he's drawing on the central dome in the facade of Fernbach. And in fact, there was a close relationship between the two because Brunner's grandfather had been president of this synagogue when it was built. He himself was almost certainly bar mitzvahed in this synagogue. And as a teenager, before he went off to study architecture at MIT, he briefly served as a draftsman, learning the craft in Fernbach's office. This is a mixture of Romanesque, the Romanesque of H.H. Richardson. It has sort of Venetian elements as well, and it has certain Moorish decorations, particularly on the interior. And then it has this great dome, this sort of square-based dome that recalls the synagogue in Rome, but that wouldn't be built until 1904. But it also harks back to the work of the Jewish architect Dankmar Adler in Chicago from the 1870s. And then Adler would go on to partner with the great architect Louis Sullivan and design buildings like this, Anshe Mariv, also in Chicago, one of the great synagogue buildings of the late 19th century, one of the great, really a revolutionary religious building in American design. Sadly, it burned almost entirely, was just not too many years ago, and has been destroyed except for its masonry framework. This building is interesting because it doesn't really have a main facade. It doesn't really have a dome, and yet the auditorium of the building is fully expressed by this tower-like structure that rises out of a fortress-like base, but the fortress-like base is pierced by big Roman arches, and in this, it recalls Adler's and Sullivan's other famous buildings like the Auditorium building in Chicago and the Marshall Field department store. And these designs are really all of a piece. But there was a great barrel vault on the inside with very good acoustics and paneled with wood, and that's one of the reasons that it burned so readily when it was struck by fire. But these are some of the alternatives, and you can see that American architects, Jewish architects, are trying to come up with new forms of expression. They're relying on some kinds of historical sources, but at the same time, they are coming up with innovative designs. There are variations, again, across the country. We find a lot in the South, which have not been much studied or talked about. I will be with my friends at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, debuting an online exhibit on the synagogues of the South in the near future. And some of these buildings will be discussed in that because it's based on these old postcard views, which are so valuable because the buildings no longer survive. But you can see examples from Texas from the 1870s through 1908. And this one on the top is Congregation Beth Israel, which is Reform, but you can see by 1908, Congregation Adath Yeshurun which is Orthodox, has adopted a similar design. The synagogue in Corsicana, Texas, and in Beaumont also have certain similarities. And we find these same designs also being carried out in New York by the architects Schneider and Herder, for instance, in their 1900 Congregation Zedek of Harlem, which still exists as a church, the New Bethel Way of the Cross. And if you're ever taking the crosstown bus in uptown Manhattan on 110th Street, you go right, well, no, sorry, this is on 118th Street. You go right by it. The Moorish style continues into the 20th century in less central places. And one of the finest examples is the Synagogue of Temple Sinai in Sumter, South Carolina. This is remarkable not so much for its architectural design, but for the stained glass. And it's here, and this is the era when we begin getting very lavish programs of figurative stained glass, at least in Reform temples. And this series that was executed by a stained glass company from Atlanta is really exceptional. And it deserves a look on its own. And I think the study of synagogue stained glass still awaits its moment. But certainly the Temple Sinai examples are extravagant and really quite superb. We have the Orthodox synagogues continuing in the Romanesque style that we talked about before. The two-tower design really doesn't go away and continues well into the late 19th and early 20th century. We saw, I think, before some examples of this. This is in Hartford. These are in Harrisburg. And you can see this two-towered type is consistent through the whole period of other stylistic designs, Gothic, Romanesque, and Moorish. There's a reliance on this form, and particularly for Orthodox congregations, which like this for an urban type of synagogue where you can have a high basement with classrooms and social halls down below. You can have a sanctuary which is approached from the street as a major place, as an important place. You go up steps, you enter through 1 to 2 or 3 doorways, and then you can still have side stairways, stair towers for the women to go up to galleries in a second level. And this design was very important and very popular, and it also allowed some congregations, Orthodox congregations, to take over former churches. And you can see one example of this. And I mentioned this in our very first lecture when I was talking about great synagogues. This is the Bet HaMadrash HaGadol in New York, which for a while was the home of the only chief rabbi for the Orthodox in the United States, Rabbi Jacob Joseph, who presided here from 1888 to 1902. It was a church, a Baptist church, and then it became a synagogue, and it was given one of these little Moorish gazebos up on top, if you will, a little kind of a canopied little belvedere. And then it was stripped down again later. And then sadly, just a few years ago, it burned and it has now been demolished. It was only one of many former churches that were turned into synagogues by newly arriving Eastern European immigrants who couldn't afford to build from scratch like those people down at Eldridge Street or at Park East Synagogue, Midtown. Rather, they would take an old church building and transform it. This is what happened with the Bialystoker Synagogue, which was an old federal building, an old federal style church from the 1820s, early 19th century. And this was turned into a synagogue around 1905, and then subsequently lavishly decorated, at least by the 1930s. The paintings were probably done in the 1920s. And then these have been repainted. These were refurbished in the 1980s, but you get a sense of the of the color and the variety of decoration that is entirely new in America, but it is something that the Eastern European immigrants brought over from Europe. We only have a few examples surviving from the many destroyed synagogues in Europe, but in America, we have a good sense of this tradition and the way it was passed down by the newly arriving immigrants to their new congregations and new communities. We have signs of the zodiac, we have scenes of the Holy Land, and we have all sorts of Jewish symbols. At the Willett Street Methodist Church, which became the Bialystoker, there's also the old Jewish tradition, the old Eastern European tradition of having that Beit Midrash down in the basement. And this is where daily prayers would be held and still are held today. And it's important to remember that the synagogue is more than just the main prayer hall or main sanctuary, but there are many other ancillary spaces, which sometimes are actually more meaningful, more important to the members of the congregation and the community. This is back at Beth HaMadrash HaGadol, that Baptist church that then had become a synagogue, a great synagogue, and then has been burned down. And we can see here the forms of this Gothic interior of the church, but later on, probably also in the 1920s, the spandrels have been painted and the spaces have been painted in with scenes of Holy Land landscapes. We have a view of the proposed but not built yet Hebrew University here flanking the Ark. So it's a mix of old and new, and it is a kind of a symbol of orthodoxy in America, but also a vision of religious Zionism too. This total decoration of synagogues was favored by many immigrant communities, and we're just beginning to document these. I've been visiting and photographing a lot of them in the last few years. Some are still used as synagogues, like the great Walnut Street shul in Chelsea, Massachusetts, Congregation Agudath Shalom. This has this marvelous sky painted on the ceiling. It has curtains over the ark. It was the largest Orthodox synagogue in Chelsea, where there were over a dozen synagogues at one time. It was a very vibrant community, one of the largest Jewish immigrant communities on the East Coast. This is still an ongoing community struggling and trying to raise money to restore and maintain their synagogue, both as an active Jewish center and as something of a museum for all those lost congregations. And you can see on the outside, it is designed with its big two towers to look very much like the Beth HaMadrash HaGadol synagogue in New York, where the chief rabbi had made his home, so to speak. And there was a connection between the Orthodox communities, obviously, of Boston and New York. Here we see that sky, and we see a picture of probably the Tomb of the Kings over there, over the Women's Gallery. And I've written about this, and I'll put up some resources if you want to read more. A similar synagogue is almost contemporary, is the Sons of Jacob in Providence, Rhode Island. This actually was built in two phases because the immigrant community didn't have money at first to complete it. So they only built the downstairs first, which is the Bet Midrash today. And then the big sanctuary that we see here, also with a painted sky, was only completed in the early 1920s. And this is remarkable because it has paintings of the animals described in the Pirkei Avot on the ark wall, and it has signs of the zodiac going around the ceiling. It has lions flanking a decalogue with the crown of the Torah over the ark. So it's a very richly painted and beautifully complete synagogue of that immigrant time. And here we see a few more views. There's also hope that this will be some kind of museum of Judaism in Providence, but that project has a long way to go. But we are hopeful that the building can be saved as a Jewish site and as a Jewish place of worship. still, and that its beautiful decorations can be maintained. There were smaller communities throughout the big cities. Every immigrants from each little town banded together in the first wave of immigration from the 1880s on, and they often built small little prayer houses. Sometimes they were almost anonymous to look at, but sometimes they raised the money to hire an architect to put up some attractive facade. So even though they were tiny, these are sometimes called tenement synagogues, but they're actually squeezed in between tenement buildings. The lots are very narrow. There isn't much natural light, and yet they still manage to create an impression of elegance and of belonging. So they're making synagogues that are essentially civic monuments, even though once you go inside, you're entering a world of really the old world. But on the front, it's a facade reaching out to engage with the new world of American civic life and American beautiful, American Renaissance aesthetics and architectural taste. After 1893, there was a great wave of classicism that spread across America. The influence of the Chicago Exposition, the Columbian Exhibition, was very strong, and we'll talk about that when we talk about modernism. So these are former synagogues. Both of these have now closed, sadly, because the congregations have aged out and the people have moved on. Their children have moved to Long Island and Westchester and Brooklyn and other places, so that this aspect of life in the Lower East Side is much diminished. Meseritz, you can see here, had a big two-story Gothic arc, and then the women were up in these galleries. The space is very, very narrow, and this was the prayer hall, and then there was a very humble and homely Bet Midrash downstairs in the basement. This is the view of the same synagogue. These were taken by the International Survey of Jewish Monuments before the synagogue was disassembled. And here, this is the view of the women's gallery, because the women were allowed in the synagogue, but they really didn't get to see very much. But they did see the top of the ark with the 10 Commandments, and they got to see this beautiful stained glass window with a Jewish star there. And more examples of this synagogue. Another example that is still in use and still active as an Orthodox congregation, I've been there many times, is the Stanton Street Shul. And this struggles, but it has a new, younger, culturally diverse community that sustains its traditions. And you can see it too has a sort of classical, modest, but a classical facade, somewhat lower than its tenement neighbors. And it too has a Bet Midrash downstairs, which has been entirely refurbished in a kind of shiny modern way. But upstairs, the prayer hall still retains its old look of what we call the tenement synagogue. We're looking from the back, and you can see the women sit here, and they have a curtain which separates their seats so they don't have to go upstairs to the gallery anymore. And then the men are in the front around the bima and the ark. These are some more views, and you can see wall paintings, which are partly covered now, but these are signs of the zodiac, the mazoles. If someone says mazel tov, it means really, may you be under a good sign, or may you have a good sign. And the sign is the sign of the zodiac. We see Ari, the lion, here, and each one of these represents different months. This is Tishrei, the scales, we know it's Libra, and this is Nisan here. And they are in these very ambitious frames, but very simply painted. So these are a mix of people who are copying probably out of books, and they have some artistic skill, but these are not highly trained artists. Now, in my talk, the first of the talk, when we looked at synagogues around the world, I mentioned the great synagogue, the old synagogue in Yanina, Greece. Well, there are a lot of immigrants came from Ioannina and from all of northern Greece to America in the early 1900s, along with out emigration from Greece of Christians as well. And they settled on the Lower East Side with all the Jews there, but they didn't mingle, they didn't fit in quite as much because they didn't speak Yiddish, they spoke Judeo-Greek, and they founded their own congregation and they built their own synagogue by the 1920s. And this is the Kehila Kadosha Ioannina that still survives and is active today. And in many ways, it looks very similar to the synagogues of the Ashkenazi, Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking congregations. It's narrow, it's long, it has its women's gallery, it has a central bima, it has memorial plaques. It doesn't have the same kind of wall decoration, though. And when these people left the Lower East Side, they went to the Bronx and to Brooklyn, and they took these traditions with them, but they had more money and they had larger congregations because some of these old Landsmannschaft, these congregations based on people from single towns, merged into congregations based on regions or some other preference of either something linking them by geography or a preference in liturgy. And we have bigger synagogues built. And this is, some of these are now churches. This is the former Chevra Linas Hatzedek now in the Bronx. And even though it's been a church for about 50 years, they've kept all the decorations of the Jewish, from the period of its Jewish use, the stained glass windows and paintings of the Decalogue and the Lions, the Temple in Jerusalem. This was hit very badly by Hurricane Sandy, but the Baptist congregation that's there has been raising money and has done a lot of work to rebuild the roof. Fortunately, the murals were not damaged in the storm and its aftermath. But the congregation does struggle, and they're committed to maintaining the Jewish history here. They feel very much they're custodians of that history. It is an expensive endeavor to conserve these windows and the murals. So the future is not entirely certain. In Brooklyn, we have a classical facade on this little synagogue, also Linat Hatzedek. Here we have the mazoles, the signs of the zodiac. They were painted on the parapets of the women's gallery. Unfortunately, between the first time I saw these and the second time, in an attempt to make the synagogue look more beautiful, all the original painting of the 1930s was painted over, and these while they look very nice today, they are not by the hands of the original immigrants. Okay, so now I want to turn to a different type of small synagogue, more in small towns than in the cities, and these draw on another tradition. This is the tradition of the wooden synagogues, the rural synagogues, but much reduced. So what we're going to find are wooden synagogues and other small, humble synagogues in towns and villages that function much like the old synagogues of the towns and villages, the shtetls of Eastern Europe, but they resemble more closely little country churches that are built across America. If they resemble any types of wooden architecture from the old country, it's these very simple rectangular buildings with gable or hipped roofs from the late 18th and early 19th century. And many of these buildings continued well into the early 20th century. So the immigrants were familiar with them. And they built synagogues like this one here in the upper right in Texas, which my great-grandfather was one of the founders of back in the early 1890s. This was in Brenham, Texas, and more recently it's been physically moved. It was the oldest standing synagogue in Texas. It was physically moved to Austin, where it is now part of the Dell campus, the Dell Jewish campus, which has a Reform and a conservative synagogue, and this now acts as a Jewish, as an Orthodox synagogue where there's a daily minyan as well. These are pictures when it was still in Brenham. There's my great grandfather, Pesach Sisnitsky, with his cow. He lived nearby, and he actually ran a lot of the services in this synagogue for many decades, well into the 1930s when he died. This type of simple wooden synagogue in a small town, we can find from the East Coast to the West Coast. These are some examples from southern New Jersey, where I actually have other family roots. This is the town, the planned Jewish community, an agricultural community of Alliance. There were actually 2 synagogues there, one of which also served as a school. And you see that here, it's no longer standing, but this one is, and it looks very much like a house, but inside it has much of the form of a traditional Eastern European synagogue with the women's gallery and a large ark with the carved lions and the Decalogue up above. No running water, and so there's an outhouse. There's no plumbing. There was an outhouse outside. Here you see a better picture of it. And while there are no Jews left in Alliance, descendants of this synagogue still contribute to its upkeep. And many of these descendants have moved to Philadelphia and to towns in southern New Jersey, Vineland and other centers, Atlantic City and the like. This type of building was very common, and you can see it reduces Gothic forms just essentially to the pointed window. It's a simple rectangular building, either wood or in some cases brick, with a gable roof, and that's all you need. Some of them had galleries across the front, and so the women only were on an area just beyond the entrance. Some were a little bit larger and had galleries on the side, but these were all Orthodox synagogues, and there was always separation of men and women. One of the best surviving today is in Burlington, Vermont, and this was the original Chavi Zedek synagogue from 1884. It still survives today, but its future is uncertain. So money is needed to sustain the building and a congregation there. That's really a topic for another conversation. But the ark is important because it was made by the immigrants. A local tinsmith and coppersmith made this copper ark, and the rabbi himself carved the lions, and we have his models still survive where he practiced his art and honed his design. This is in Middleton, Pennsylvania. It looks almost like the synagogue in Burlington, and it's still active. A congregation from Harrisburg uses it. It's a conservative synagogue today, and you see many of the same qualities. And this is the view from the women's gallery up above. We have synagogues made by fur trappers and Jewish traders in Tupper Lake, up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and they have many of the same characteristics. And then here's an example from Winnipeg, Canada, very similar with the little turrets, gives it a bit of that more Moorish design. Or here we have an example from Leadville, Colorado, which has recently been restored as a museum. So this wood frame, simple church-like building was common in small towns across the country. Occasionally they were a little bit more lavish, like this brick building in Virginia, Minnesota, which had some beautiful stained glass windows. And this has recently been restored as a long-term community, a grassroots project of descendants of Jews from Virginia with local people. And just this year, it's been turned over to a local music performing arts group center, which will continue its upkeep and use it as a performance center. Now, the last building I want to talk about is one of my favorites. It's one that doesn't exist anymore in its totality, but we have a great reminder of the art. And this is the former Chai Adam congregation, which splintered off that earlier synagogue I showed from Burlington, Vermont. And this is an old picture of it. This is what it looks like more or less today. And it is an apartment building. And unbeknownst to people who lived in this apartment, mostly University of Vermont, Burlington students, they were living in an apartment behind which was a massive and spectacular mural that decorated this synagogue from a period of refurbishment in about 1910. And this is a mural that was painted by a young Lithuanian artist who was brought over from Kovno to decorate the synagogue. And then he stayed in Burlington for the rest of his life. He married his sweetheart, who was, I think, the daughter of the Hebrew teacher. He himself was not particularly religious. He was confirmed Yiddishist, and he wrote plays and columns and news articles and other things in Yiddish. And he didn't continue as a fine arts painter, but he became a sign painter, Benzion black, the finest signs of the best kind, signs of the finest kind. And his work was known all over Burlington and upstate Vermont. Here is all we have of our knowledge surviving of the original decoration. We have this apse that projects where the ark was, which is somewhat unusual. And there are texts on the walls. These are prayers, Kimitzion, and we have a bit of Matovu, and here we have the 10 Commandments. And you can see, this is Matovu, so Matovu went around the side, so that's how goodly are thy tents, O Jacob. And here is Ben Zion Black. This is a paint picture of him as a youngish man. He was maybe even younger when he painted this mural. This is what it looked like in the mid-1980s when the building was turned into an apartment building. It had been a carpet warehouse before that, because the synagogue had closed in the 1930s. Here under this painting, we have Kimitzion, out of Zion shall go forth the Torah. I find this a particularly appropriate prayer to include here because it's really recognizes the centrality of Jerusalem and Zion, but it seems appropriate for a diaspora community that has come, if not from the Jerusalem of Lithuania, which was Vilna, at least from Kovno, which was the major Jewish Lithuanian city in Lithuania, because Vilna was really Polish. And maybe Kimitzion out of Zion is a nod to the painter, Ben Zion Block, as he was, and then he changed that to Black when he came to America. So we have fragments of paintings that have been recovered in recent years from destroyed synagogues in Poland and other places in Eastern Europe. And in Vermont, the interest in starting around the year 2012 was, does that mural still survive in the apartment building? And the walls were opened up and it was discovered to be intact, but had deteriorated greatly since it had been walled over. And a conservator was brought in, Connie Silver, and work began, and it was a multi-year project. But we found these beautiful paintings, and I worked on this project, so I'm very, very emotionally attached to it. But these beautiful birds and landscapes, and eventually the whole thing was conserved, cut out of the building. It's an enormous effort, and I think there isn't a lecture where I talk about this online still today. But eventually it's been reinstalled in the current Ohavizedek synagogue, and which is just about a quarter of a mile away. The Jews in Burlington didn't move to the suburbs. And it's been largely consolidated and conserved, but still more funds are needed to do the final restoration. This photo was taken at the time of the move, so it does look a little bit better now than it does here, but it still needs the final work. And this corresponds to other painted decoration and carved decoration that immigrants made through in American synagogues. And this is the bima from, I'm sorry, the ark from Sioux City, Iowa, which is now in the Jewish Museum in New York, and just comparing it with some of the lavishly carved and painted arks that we know were in the wooden synagogues and masonry synagogues too in Eastern Europe, almost all of which were destroyed in the Holocaust. And we do have a few ark makers, cabinet makers who were immigrants, just like those immigrant painters. The best known one is from the Boston area, a man named Sam Katz, and a number of his arks survive. This one is almost certainly a Sam Katz one in the Vilna Shul in Boston. This one in the Orchard Street Shul in New Haven may or may not be, but there are other ones in the region. And he loved to have an American eagle there surmounting his ark in honor of his adopted country. A lot of immigrant artists, found employment in America. Many of the people who carved the lions on the arks and the eagles on the arks also carved carousel horses and other animals. And there was a great exhibition about this at the Folk Art Museum in New York a number of years ago, curated by the artist Murray Zimilis. These immigrant artists, spread across the country. And just to bring it back to California, we have the Breed Street Shul from 1923 in Los Angeles, up in Boyle Heights. And while we might talk about this in the context of modernism, you should see that the paintings inside are part of this same tradition. And this is what it looked like as late as 1986 when Bill Aaron took this photo. This synagogue is much deteriorated now, although there's been a restoration effort going on for many years, making this into a community center. There's no real Jewish population there. It's mostly Hispanic, but the building is still an important one in the neighborhood. This is what it looked like when I was there, I think 2 years ago. And notable are these trees that flank the ark. One of them is clearly an etrog tree, and the other, I'll show it to you. The other has no root, has no fruit, but it's probably the hadas or the myrtle tree, which is one of the 4 species and is described in Leviticus. And we also have instruments that refer to the 150th Psalm. And then here we have Pisces, or the fish, for one of the months. So here are the trees again. And this is a different type of painting. It doesn't look like the paintings on the East Coast, but it's the same tradition. And one can almost imagine someone working for one of the animation studios in Hollywood, coming out and designing these. And then in the Bet Midrash behind, which was built in the former synagogue, which has physically moved, there's also this oil on canvas painting, which somewhat resembles the Benzion black image of the Decalogue with the curtains and other elements that we saw in Vermont. And this was in very bad condition and has recently been restored. So we'll stop with that, and we'll be able to pick up now with other buildings of the 20th century, but at least that gives you a taste of the variety of synagogues that were built in the late 19th and early 20th century. As the earlier German merchant, community, which had been established for 2 generations, aspired to and achieved a substantial architectural presence with big masonry synagogues in cities. They were then confronted by this new wave of Eastern European poor immigrants who aspired in some ways to be like the Germans and build big synagogues, but for the most part also wanted to keep a connection to their home countries and home traditions, and were happy, at least for a generation or two, to maintain these small, really intimate and almost clubhouse-like synagogues where they could almost get away from being in America and take a step back to the country that they had left behind. The story of the Jews in America in the 20th century, though, is increasingly or entirely one of Americanization. And to a large extent, though, it will be a period of reinvention, especially after the Depression and World War II. And we'll look at that in the third official talk about modernism. We'll look at modernism in America, but we'll also see its reach around the globe as well. So I'll see you at the next talk, and I hope you have time. You'll have enjoyed this if you had time to listen.